and unleashed a special brand of mayhem on Allied ships. They put a chokehold on England that nearly starved her into submission twice in 1 century. Now, U-boats, next on Modern Marvels.
After more than 70 years, they are still being found. The rusted remains of the deadliest submarine force in history. To some, they were known as the Gray Wolves. Others called them steel coffins. But all came to respect the power of the U-boats. Today, the ocean floor is home to the carnage of 2 world wars. 8,000 cargo ships, and the skeletal remains of over 80,000 combatants. Untouched for decades, the twisted hulls of the German U-boats belie the threat they once posed, for twice in a generation they alone held the fate of Europe in their grasp.
Our crews, they were so young. This was an adventure for them. We didn't think about the problems connected with, we only thought about the target, big fat targets.
At that moment you wished you were in the infantry or in the army, where you have at least your foxhole. And in a submarine, they are all heroes or cowards. There's no escape.
The submarine was just a fledgling weapon when it first went to war in 1914. The German Navy held its surface ships back initially and ordered its fleet of 20 undersea boats to stop the flow of raw materials to the island nation of England. The English Navy took little notice. They had submarines of their own, but few British admirals thought underwater ships would dare tangle with the big guns of their surface fleet.
Initially in the First World War, the German Navy were operating their submarines on a sort of a lone wolf basis. For this, they required good intelligence. They didn't have long-range aircraft to provide this. They had to rely upon agents reporting the sailings of convoys from New York or Halifax in Nova Scotia, and they then had to use dead reckoning to try and put themselves into a position where they could intercept these convoys. They were controlled by wireless, which gave them the latest updates of information that had been received. It was a very hit-and-miss operation.
On September 22, 1914, U-9 was cruising off the Dutch coast when it came upon 3 12,000-ton British armored cruisers. Lieutenant Otto Weddigen calmly ordered his sub to dive. His men had never fired a torpedo in combat, nor had they ever seen a ship blow up. Within minutes, they prepared the fire control tubes, and the order was given to fire. In the confusion that followed, all the ships stopped. On board, the crews thought they had stumbled onto a minefield. As they began to turn around, 4 more torpedoes were launched. Within 1 hour, the 3 ships and 1,460 of their men slipped beneath the surface. Most never knew what hit them. The attack shocked the British Admiralty. No one would dispute the submarine's arrival as a viable weapon of war.
The U-boats invariably approached on the surface where they had a speed of perhaps 15 knots. Merchant ships in those days did 7, 8, maybe 9 knots if they were fast merchant ships. This meant the U-boat could maneuver into a favorable position. If the surface ship was unarmed, the U-boat would then come alongside, order the crew to abandon, sink the ship with its deck gun. Bullets were relatively cheap. Torpedoes were relatively expensive. If the ship was armed or there was an escort ship in the area, then the U-boat would submerge just before it came into view of the merchant ship, fire torpedoes, sink it that way, without giving the crew any warning.
The sinkings only bolstered the morale and audacity of the U-boat crews, and they became bolder. Using a deck gun as their primary weapon, They sunk 31 ships for every sub lost.
The losses were so appalling that they had to do something. The food supplies in Britain in 1917 got down to 6 weeks.
The German U-boats developed a stranglehold on Britain that was only broken with the American intervention in 1917.
The U.S. and Britain instituted a system of ocean-going convoys. Cargo ships bound for England sailed close together and relied on destroyer escorts to protect them. Altogether, the anti-submarine forces sunk 178 submarines, half of the U-boat fleet.
With the convoys came almost complete protection. The individual U-boats could not get into the protected convoys, and so they ended that war figuring we've solved the problem.
After the war ended, the Treaty of Versailles directed all remaining German Navy ships to be turned over to the United Kingdom. One by one, the German submarines sailed into the Royal Navy anchorage at Scapa Flow. Within weeks, most of them were scrapped. Under terms of the treaty, Germany was also forbidden to build or sail any more underwater vessels. German sub-research continued undercover. Working out of a shipbuilding firm in Holland, German engineers built several submarines for sale to other countries. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, he found a corps of U-boat engineers ready for an all-out manufacturing effort. 2 years later, Hitler announced he was throwing off the shackles of Versailles. In June of 1935, he signed a new accord, the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. Germany agreed to maintain its navy at 35% of the strength of the British Royal Navy. Submarines were now permitted to be built to 45% of the British subforce. With the treaty signed, Hitler was satisfied he would have no war with Britain and turned his attention to rebuilding his Luftwaffe and panzer divisions. The English, on the other hand, saw little use for submarines. Besides, they were working on ASDIC, an underwater sonar detection system. By 1937, they were so confident of its potential, the British Shipping Defense Committee said, submarines will never again present a threat to the Royal Navy. Of all the naval exercises carried out by Britain between the wars, not one was devoted to the defense of trade convoys. In the meantime, the German submarine program began to flourish again.
The inspiration behind the development of the German U-boat fleet was Karl Dönitz. He made considerable steps to improve the safety, for example, escape apparatus for his crews. He also looked at the types and tactics and operations that they would be carrying out in the event of war. He took the submarines themselves on further than any other single person had done in terms of inspiration.
By the end of 1935, 14 U-boats had already materialized in the shipyards at Kiel. To hide and protect them, underground submarine pens were built, bolstered by 12-foot concrete ceilings, anti-aircraft guns, and the latest in acoustical airplane sound detectors. For the submarine service, only volunteers were accepted.
We knew that we had to do our duty for our country. Perhaps that's in the mentality of German people, especially the youth of that time. I belonged to the Hitler Youth, and it was more being a hero, and that was made me volunteer for the Navy.
It was tough, it was congested, it was dirty, it was hard, but it also, you were men when you came back from 1 or 2 patrols. The Navy was part of the cream already, but the submariners were the cream of the Navy.
We had to be very, very smart, because when we went to school, we had to answer questions in a certain way. And when we got asked for something, they had to answer right away without taking a minute finding the reason why or what we were asked for. And that's, I think, a program to select people who were able and who were not able, because a lot of them, after the school or even during the school time, they were sent to other parts of the Navy because they were not able to join submarine crews.
In 1937, Dönitz organized extensive naval war games in the North Sea to test a number of his theories. His men had learned to attack at night for surprise and on the surface where sonar wasn't effective. Dönitz also moved the U-boats in from their normal attack range of 1 3/4 miles to just 550 yards from their target. Now they didn't need to fire a salvo of shots when one well-placed torpedo could do the job.
A torpedo is a ship, a submarine by itself. It's very expensive. In our case, it was always a saying, a torpedo, a ship, which could not always be accomplished. A torpedo was preset for the distance, for the speed, for the depth, so that they could hit a target broadside.
Early torpedoes were percussion ignited, exploding only on direct contact with a ship. Later, a magnetic ignition was incorporated that set off the torpedo when it entered the magnetic field of a ship at sea. Now the depth setting was less critical. The torpedoes would now explode beneath a ship's hull and have a better chance of sinking it. The Anglo-German treaty restricted the total tonnage of German submarines, but not their amount. Admiral Dönitz maintained there was strength in numbers. 4 small U-boats were far more effective than 1 4 times larger, he said.
The aim of the Germans was that by the beginning of the war, which they expected to be in 1942 rather than 1939, that they would have some 100 U-boats at sea. As it was in 1939, they had only a little over 30. But those 30 almost brought the United Kingdom to its knees when it stood alone against Nazi Germany.
The Navy designed many types of U-boats, but most were of 3 classifications. The small Type 2 was used for training and coastal patrols in the Baltic and North Sea. It weighed around 250 tons. The Type 9, between 1,100 and 1,400 tons, was designed for long patrols through the Atlantic and beyond. The medium-sized Type 7 weighed between 500 and 750 tons. Engineered for long cruises, it was built in far greater numbers than any other submarine in history. 2 1,400 horsepower diesel engines drove it on the surface at speeds of 17 knots. The moment she submerged, engineers switched over to 2 750 horsepower electric motors that produced a top speed of 8 knots. Two days after the Blitzkrieg attack on Poland, Britain declared war on Germany. 46 U-boats were available, but only 22 were designed for long ranges. Still, they attempted to strangle Britain's supply lines and return to the same battleground where they had fought 20 years earlier. On October 14, 1939, the U-boat Corps had perhaps its grandest hour. Lieutenant Gunther Prien was given the mission to attack the British fleet at Scapa Flow. The largest of all the Royal Navy harbors, Scapa Flow guarded the exit route of the German Navy from the North Sea. That night, Lieutenant Prien took his U-47 into the British harbor and edged past the rusted remains of the scuttled World War I German fleet. There he found the target, the battleship Royal Oak. Prien launched a salvo of torpedoes, but they didn't detonate. Then he ordered more, which exploded under the ship's keel. The 25-year-old veteran of the Battle of Jutland capsized and sank 13 minutes later, along with her crew of 833 men. The U-boat quietly slipped out of the harbor.
It was a great coup for the U-boat force. It was one of the first great propaganda victories of Germany, because they could point out that even in the home base of the British fleet, U-boats could easily penetrate. And the British were forced to move the fleet out of Scapa Flow, rebuild the defenses, and it really hurt their ability to rapidly deploy into the North Sea.
Each month, Britain was dependent on 1,000 cargo ships to bring it the food and raw materials to survive. As First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill armed his merchantmen and reinstituted the convoy system.
Spring of 1940, when Germany defeated France, a decision was made to base the U-boats in French ports. The reason for this was it would save a lot of transit time from German ports, plus the U-boats would not have to go around the coast of Scotland and Britain, where they would be more vulnerable to British anti-submarine forces.
One of the interesting things that they had to help them was the long-range Focke-Wulf Condor bomber. This aircraft converted for maritime reconnaissance, flying from bases in France, was able to pinpoint convoys and radio that information to the U-boats. I suppose really the Condor was one of the most serious risks to convoy operations and one of the greatest assets to a U-boat.
The happy time is how the submariners described the summer of 1940. In June, 58 ships were sunk. July saw 38 sunk. August, 56. All with the loss of just one U-boat.
The convoys were consisted of about 40, 50 ships, and they usually drove in 4 lines, surrounded by destroyers. The mishap of a convoy is always that they have to regulate their speed according to the slowest of their ships, and that brought them sometimes down to 8 miles an hour.
The convoys called for both discipline and patience. To compensate for their slow speeds, the convoys changed course frequently, zigzagging their way across the ocean. In October 1940, a convoy of 35 ships left Newfoundland. Only 14 made it to England. To compound the problem, U.S. shipping insurance companies continued to share their risks with European underwriters and freely corresponded with information detailing freighter cargo and sailing dates. These details routinely fell into the hands of German naval intelligence.
For the first 3 years of the war, the Germans had free access to our sailing instructions, the composition of our convoys, and it makes my hair stand on end now to think that with all the secrecy we had, that the Germans had the information almost as fast as we did.
The U-boat skippers always left their ports with sealed orders under the cover of darkness.
When the U-boats went to sea, they were going out for a 30, 60-day patrol. Every bit of space in the U-boat was filled with supplies. Some ammunition, but mostly food. U-boats had 2 small bathrooms or heads. When they went to sea, one was stuffed with food. The decks inside the submarine were covered with food, and then planks put over the cans and the bags, and the men walked on the planks the first few weeks. Of course, there was no air conditioning. The submarine stank from diesel oil. Because of the limited amount of water that they could distill and that they could carry, showers were rarely taken.
We only could wash ourselves out of a small pail, but not with fresh water. We had to use seawater, and seawater, as you know, after a certain time, when the water is absorbed, there's only salt left, and that salt is getting sticky.
Half of the crew bunked in the bow section, an area no wider than 12 feet across, and slept next to the torpedoes.
In the submarine itself, you always hot bunked. That is, there were bunks for maybe half the crew. So if a man was on duty, there was someone in his bunk, his bunkmate. When he got off duty, the bunkmate went on duty, and he got the bunk, nice and warm and a little smelly.
Every crewman had the right to leave his U-boat as soon as a replacement could be found, no questions asked.
Being locked in a steel tube with 30 or 40 other guys for 30 or 60 days, psychologically quite a problem. They underwent psychological testing, and most of their officers and skippers were outstanding to keep the boat under control. And then when the crisis came of being attacked or attacking, to get the crew to work together and to perform, in some cases, magnificently.
The moment the torpedo hit, there was a great relief because you have been out there for weeks. You have been trying to find somebody. And this from day to day, looking and trying to find is wearing you down. In a submarine patrol, there are many, many days where you're just out there searching and trying to find, and that ocean is so big, and you're so small, and you have such a short area of seeing something. The boat would go to a certain speed to conserve diesel oil, and that would be a slow speed. If all at once the engine picks up, there must be something, there must be a target, or somebody must have seen somebody. So out of the bunks, every head comes out. What's going on? What's going on? We have changed, we have increased our speed. Is there anything? And then you try to find out. So then when you really have a target, and then if you really can shoot at the target, there's a relief.
The German U-boat men, the Kriegsmarine, had two kinds of uniforms: blue for men who served in the boat, and gray for men who served ashore. U-boats will return in a moment to modern marvels.
After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the course of the war was unalterable, and Hitler ordered his U-boats to American waters. The U-boats would lie on the shallow ocean floor by day and rise to the surface at night.
I saw only the cars driving with the headlights still on, but they didn't expect us. They could not, nobody in the world, all the skilled people of the Navy and of the submarine forces, they could not imagine that the Germans could accomplish to come to cross the whole Atlantic, fight there, and still have enough fuel to go back.
We kept the lights on in early '42 on our East Coast cities. Part of the reason was our coastal shipping needed the lights to navigate along the coast. But of course, these were also beacons for German submarines.
With the lights of New York, Cape Hatteras, and Miami behind them, the American ships were perfectly silhouetted at night.
The German submarines were just killing our convoys, especially the tankers coming out of Venezuela, trying to get to ports in New Orleans. They would just lay in wait for those tankers to come out of there and then just have a field day. They just used them for target practice.
At the maximum, during the next 6 months, the Germans never had more than 12 submarines on the station. And this was about 600 men manning those submarines. Yet, in that 6 months period, they sank 2.5 million tons of shipping right along our coast. You could see the ship burning off from the beaches.
Along the coast, U.S. forces mobilized. Major harbors were lined with steel anti-submarine nets and patrolled by torpedo boats. With Navy blimps overhead and thousands of volunteer private yachts below, all eyes were on the lookout. As the number of U-boats grew, their skippers began to concentrate their attacks in the middle of the Atlantic, where long-range surveillance aircraft couldn't patrol for long. Here, the U-boats executed Admiral Dönitz' master strategy, attacking in groups, known as wolf packs.
Each of the boats, when we were out, 10, 12 boats, later on 15 boats, had a square to go up and down with lowest speed, one propeller, 12 hours south and the same distance, 12 hours north. When one of the boats got connection with a convoy, then it was not permitted to attack, but it gave this information to headquarters in Paris, and they ordered then the other boats to that position.
Running at 17 knots on the surface, the U-boats could outpace the convoys.
We saw the smoke of the convoys, and then we approached them closer till we saw the masts and the funnel, but never that close that we saw their bridge, because when we saw their bridge, they were able to see us too.
Once the U-boats met, they waited until dark.
5, 6, 7, or 8 submarines were coordinated by a leader. He'd station perhaps 2 submarines ahead of the convoy, 2 to attack from the side, and 1 to catch stragglers from behind. They could use decoy operations, and one submarine attacking the escorts and drawing them off, while the other submarines attacked the merchant ships.
Probably The worst moments were when you knew there was no help coming, you were going to fight it out as you were, and you had 4 or 5 ships burning at one time.
The radio men or the engine personnel, they're down in the boat. They don't see anything. There's only about a dozen of people in any submarine who see what's going on. But once the Commandant Guggenberger led me up at the bridge for a few minutes. I never forget that picture. It's ingrained in my head. And what I saw there was a large tanker with a flame as high as the tanker was long above that. And I know what I felt it, and I felt great pity for the sailors on that tanker.
In 1941, the submarines made 445 ships disappear at a cost of only 38 of their own. The commercial shipping business was devastated. Lloyd's of London insurance bookkeepers worked overtime calculating their losses. A new torpedo was introduced in 1942 that gave the U-boats greater protection and even more firepower. The Lute torpedoes traveled in a straight line for a predetermined distance and then zigzagged in spirals and figure-8 patterns. Inside a convoy, it had a greater chance of hitting a ship. In 1942, another type of U-boat appeared, Type 14, known as the Milk Cow. This long-range tanker carried 700 tons of diesel fuel and other supplies. When U-boats rendezvoused with them in the middle of the Atlantic, they were replenished with fuel, food, and more ammunition. For some, this increased their cruise time up to 8 weeks. With pennants that showed their conquests, the U-boat crews returned home to a hero's welcome.
Oh, there was always music there were bands there were girls there with flowers. There was somebody there to give you a beer or another drink, and there was cheering, a lot of cheering, and then usually one of the admirals or even donuts would receive you, and then you got your decorations, and then you were able to get a shower, a shave, feel clean again, smell better than before. So it was a nice feeling to be home. And of course, when you're home, you were safe once more. You had life with you once more.
Although never seeing any action, the Walter U-boat was able to reach a speed of 23 knots. This is more than twice the underwater speed of any submarine in the world at that time. Today, the Soviet Alpha-class fast attack submarines are able to reach 42 knots. U-boats will return in a moment on Modern Marvels.
In 1942, German submarines had sunk 1,094 freighters. By December, Dönitz had at his disposal 397 submarines, nearly 100 more than he had originally hoped for.
In 1943, Britain was within a couple of weeks of being starved out of the war. The German submarine attacks on convoys were so successful in 1943 that the British considered giving up convoys, and yet convoys was what had saved them in World War I. But the U-boat was that much more effective.
But the Wolfpack strategy had its weaknesses as well. It put too much responsibility on the lone shadowing U-boat. When the convoys began organizing air cover behind them, the submarine was forced to dive, and at slower speeds underwater couldn't keep up. The centralized command of the U-boats was their greatest liability. In order to transmit their positions, they had to break radio silence. Unknown to the U-boats, their transmissions were being picked up by several Allied shore stations. Working in unison, the stations homed in on the direction of the radio messages and made a fix of their position. The convoys were rerouted, and the nearest destroyers were dispatched to the area. In May of 1941, the British perfected an ocean-going surface radar that could detect a conning tower from 2.5 miles away.
Radar meant that the U-boat could not easily surface without being detected. Radar could sight them in rain, in darkness, force them to remain submerged even at night. This really deprived the U-boats of their mobility.
With the range of air cover gradually being extended on both sides of the Atlantic, the air gap in the middle was shortened down to only 600 miles. Dönitz then decided to pull his U-boats to the north. The war in the Atlantic took a dramatic turn in 1943.
In March, we lost nearly 100 ships, and the losses among the crews were terrible because of the storms. You didn't recover many of them. Then the greatest convoy battle of all time was fought in the middle of March, and that was a combined convoy within 100 miles either way, a 100 by 100 mile area. You had 80 merchant ships, 20 men of war, 44 submarines, and innumerable liberators and Sunderlandsmen, and everybody was milling around in that small section of ocean with their guns and torpedoes ready, and it was a wild, fierce battle.
In April, the convoys managed to drive off all attacking subs. In May, 42 U-boats were sunk, up from 15 the previous month. From then on, the U-boats were on the defensive.
The major anti-submarine warfare weapon for surface ships in the Second World War was the depth charge. Basically, explosive TNT packed into a container with a barostat pressure system that would be set prior to its launch. If you thought the submarine was at 100 feet, you'd set it to explode perhaps at 120 feet, and the next pattern to explode at 90 feet in order to try and bracket the submarine.
You can hear the splash of the depth charges when they hit the surface. And then we counted the seconds, and then you heard the explosion. As long as they were above us or sideways, it was not dangerous or deadly. But it was a terrible feeling. The worst what you can do is stand there, looking upwards, listening, and waiting for the next depth charge. That drives everybody crazy.
Dead charges is not a very nice feeling. Your boat is shaking, lights are breaking, people are getting gray in their face, and nobody is saying a word. You can only whisper, not even that if possible, because you don't want to make any sound. Any sound travels underwater better than in the air.
The only defense the U-boats had during a depth charge attack was to dive deeper than the explosions. As the boats submerged, however, the external pressure increased rapidly, testing the limits to which a U-boat commander would dare take his ship. At 500 feet, the water pressure was 16 tons per square foot.
Nobody knows how much deeper you can go, because those ones who reached deeper depths, they cannot tell anymore. They were killed, they're pressed together.
The U-boats countered with a sensor that detected Allied radar signals. Anti-aircraft guns were installed in the spring of 1943. In 1941, the first of a new kind of radar set was installed in aircraft of the British Coastal Command. Small and powerful, the air-to-surface radar could locate U-boats once they had surfaced. Its only drawback was its failure to function at close range. During the final stages of an approach, the contact faded, and only a visual sighting could pinpoint the U-boat's position. At night, the U-boats with anti-aircraft guns were still immune to some degree. The British remedied this situation with the Lee light.
With this light, the British developed a new set of tactics. They would use radar to generally approach the submarine, then turn off the radar and turn off their engines and glide toward the submarine. This way, the submarine's radar detection device would not pick up the aircraft. They wouldn't hear the aircraft. Then, when the pilot estimated he was at the right distance from the surfaced U-boat, would switch on this giant strobe light, totally destroy the night vision of the people on the bridge who were manning the guns. And in those few seconds, he had a field day.
The victory of radar in the summer of 1943 made it clear that the U-boats would have to be removed from the surface or give up the Battle of the Atlantic completely.
In an effort to overcome this, the Germans started fitting what was called a snorkel, or snort, to to their submarines. This was literally a breathing tube. Invented by the Dutch in the 30s, Germans took it over during the war, and their submarines could then steam along underwater with the snorkel raised, run their diesel engines to charge their batteries.
But the snorkels presented more problems than they solved. In rough weather, the valves would shut, creating a vacuum in the fresh air tube for the crew.
Every time the snorkel would open or close or is overrun by a wave, you would get some water into the intake. Your ears try to jump out of your head, or your eardrums try to jump out of your head, and it also has a sucking effect on your eyes.
By 1944, the Allies produced a radar set capable of detecting even the small head of the snorkel. By the end of 1943, Germany had 442 operational U-boats, but it also lost 245.
The Hedgehog weapon throws 24 small projectiles several hundred feet ahead of the attacking vessel. Immediately upon entering the water, the 32-pound projectiles arm and explode on contact with the U-boat. U-boats will return in a moment on modern models.
In June 1944, the USS Guadalcanal and her submarine hunter-killer group were on patrol off the coast of Africa when the destroyer Chatelaine picked up a possible sound contact. Two Wildcats overhead confirmed the presence of a submarine below. Within minutes, the Chatelaine began throwing depth charges at the target area. The submarine U-505 sustained a close hit, which jammed her rudder. The ship's captain gave the order to abort. Don Carter was a signalman aboard the USS Guadalcanal.
In that vast Atlantic, you consider how big it is. And there we were, just run up on one another, right in the middle of the destroyer escort. They had them surrounded when they come up.
3 destroyers surrounded U-505 as it broke the surface. It was pelted from all angles. Small caliber anti-aircraft fire and 50 caliber machine guns from the Wildcats overhead. If the order to abort was given, it was standard procedure for all U-boat crew members to get out of their sub and into rubber rafts. 3 designated men would then set delayed explosives, giving them 15 minutes to leave the sub and get away. One of 3 crew members left on board, Hans Gerbler, pulled the plug on the main seacock, and water began rushing in.
I was going to make sure that that boat really went down. I took the cover from a sea strainer, that's the filter from the main valve, the so-called bottom valve, off, and threw it in the corner. But if I would have known that the enemy had in its mind entering that sub, I would have thrown it in the bilge.
As soon as Captain Gallery in the carrier Guadalcanal realized what was happening, he ordered the submarine to be captured.
Not since 1815 had an American boarding party captured an enemy man of war on the high seas.
We were sure that the boat would disappear from the service within a couple of more minutes. All of a sudden, we saw whaleboats coming from one of them destroyers toward the sub, and we thought them guys must not be right in their head doing that, because that's something as jumping in a burning fire. I myself did not even know that the demolition charges were not set in action. So I was waiting for the moment that the U-505 was blown in pieces.
The first Americans to board the U-505 were from the USS Pillsbury. Don Carter's boarding party arrived shortly afterwards and began securing a tow rope to the stricken sub.
The only thing that I thought about when I set my foot on the decks of that submarine, that we had guys going down that conning tower, that somebody would open one of them doors and it'd be booby-trapped and we'd get blowed about 9 miles in the air.
Nothing happened, and that made us feel in some way very, very sad and very bad, because we knew that we were the only German submarine captured by the U.S. Navy.
They got the seacock closed, which kept the water from coming in. So they went forward and raided the captain's office, got the code book. That code book gave away every secret that the German subs had. They could decode their messages. They knew where they were in port.
The code books were flown to Washington, and Captain Gallery called his crew together.
And he told us how important it was to keep this a secret because of all the information that we had got. Captain Gallery told us that if anybody ever talked about this, they would eventually find out who he was, and there would be no trial. It'd be a court-martial shot at sunrise. So, and that put the fear of God in everybody. They said it was the best kept secret of World War II.
The last 2 years, you had hunter-killer groups, plenty of air cover, a lot of escorts, so it was a slaughter. The Germans lost 785 U-boats during the war, and probably at no time in recorded military history has a force kept its morale up so well in the face of such appalling losses.
On May 4th, 1945, Dönitz ordered all U-boats home. After his surrender to Allied forces, he signaled for them to surface and surrender to the British. His last transmission read, "You have all fought like lions. Now I must give you the hardest order of your career. To rise to the surface, hoist a large black flag, and surrender to the enemy." For the second time in 30 years, the U-boats failed in their bid to defeat the world's navies and were destined to finish their careers in enemy ports. Intact, left much the way it was after its capture, U-505 stands in mute testimony to the memory of